Good afternoon. We are at the Seattle Antiquarian Book Fair. The date is Sunday, October 12th, 2008. I'm Taylor Bowie, and I'm sitting here speaking with a well-known bookseller from Texas, Kevin MacDonnell. Kevin, welcome.
Hi, Taylor.
Thank you for sitting down for our little interview here. First, just start us off. Tell us a little about your background, your family, where you were born and raised, where you went to school, things like that.
Born in Florida, Tampa, Florida, on Davis Island, and raised in Houston, Texas. Began my book collecting in 1968 when I was in high school. I was 15 years old. Bought a book in an Indianapolis bookstore. I don't remember the name of the bookstore, but I remember the book. And the book was a 1833, the first school edition of the Webster Dictionary. It cost me $3. It was a choice of that book or a Mark Twain book, 1923 Speeches in a Dust Jacket. That was $5, and that seemed like a stretch at the time.
A lot of money.
And you'd think because I became a prominent Mark Twain collector that I would have bought the Twain book. It would have been prophetic. It would have, but it would be a great story, but it just didn't happen out there. I bought the Webster Dictionary. I left the Twain on the shelf. Stupid me.
How did you happen to find yourself in Indianapolis?
My family, grandfather, great aunts, great uncles, all my father's and mother's side of the family were all from Indiana. And centered in Indianapolis, and so we went back there for Christmas every year, and we happened to be back there in the summer of '68, and just stopped by a big used bookstore, went in and found that book, and I was just surprised you could buy a book of that age, of that interest, for $3. About as much as that was about what I got paid for mowing lawns at that time.
Was yours a bookish family? Were there a lot of books around when you were growing up?
Not especially. No. I was a bookish kid. So.
Were you attracted to books in general, or was it the idea of the old book that most appealed to you early on?
No, books in general. It wasn't old books. Like I said, that was the first time I found an older book in a bookshop, and it wasn't even clearly identified as the first school edition, but it seemed to be. And I just thought it was interesting, and for $3, I just bought it on a hunch.
So you grew up in Houston, spent most of your time there.
Grew up in Houston, moved to Austin after I graduated from college and high school. I worked.
Where'd you go to college?
University of Houston. Got a degree in English literature, and then went to work at University of Houston Libraries, and was a rare book cataloger back from about 1972 to 78, for about 6 years there. Worked for Marion Orgain. She was assistant director of the libraries, Columbia Library grad, as she would have been quick to tell you. And she hired me because by that time I was collecting books, and I was buying and selling books on the side, kind of like a drug addict who buys and sells drugs on the side to support their habit. And she decided it was cheaper to...
You didn't consider yourself a bookseller, just sort of
no,
adjunct to your collecting.
It was just a way to generate a few extra dollars to buy other books personally. And she decided it would be cheaper to hire me and have me working at the library, buying books for the library, than to be buying books from me. And that was her theory behind hiring me. And I learned a lot from her. I learned rare book cataloging, bibliography, a very formalized training. In fact, in my last years at the University of Houston, my job was to train the people who already had library degrees how to catalog rare books. I had just an affinity for collating a book, determining its structure and bibliography, and that just got me deeper into it. But I also learned at University of Houston, I remember we had booksellers that would come by, Fred White, Tom Taylor, Dan Geis from, what was the California firm he worked for at the time?
Bennett Marshall.
And Jake Zeitlin, and different people would come through. Michael Pampantonio came down for a Grolier Club trip. Yep, and he and John S. Van Ecombe were kind of mentors as well. Bought things from them. The booksellers seemed to be doing all the traveling, handling all the new and interesting books, different books every day, and making all the money and having all the fun. And I was sitting in a library cubicle cataloging books, looking at the same damn books every day, not traveling anywhere, not getting very well paid, having as much fun as I could stand, but it wasn't much. And I decided there had to be something better. And so I left Houston and went after my library degree. I stupidly still didn't think about bookselling, but I sensed that that's where the money was, that's where the fun was, the travel, and you get to see new and interesting books all the time. And so that appealed to me, but I still figured, well, that's just not a stable, steady career. But I moved to Austin with my wife, and we had a little baby at that time, and got into library school, got my master's in library science, and was all ready to go to work in libraries, and jobs were hard to get. I came in second place for a position at Yale University out of a field of 170. For second place, you don't even get a cigar.
It's not like horseshoes.
No, and the interviews were fun, and the trip up and everything was nice, but that was it. I was offered a job in Menominee, Wisconsin. They tried to lure me up there, telling me how good the ice fishing was. They had to explain to me what ice fishing was.
Sure, as a Texas boy, that appealed a lot to you.
They told me they got colder than Canada at certain times in the winter. Having been born in Tampa, Florida, and raised in Houston, this wasn't a selling point. They thought it was. Their Chamber of Commerce catchphrase was, they got 30 degrees below zero 10 days a year, and 10 degrees below zero 30 days a year. And that with the ice fishing, they offered me the job over the phone, sight unseen. All they had was my resume, and I declined it. And so for a year, I supported myself in Austin bookselling while I was looking for library work. And in the meantime, got offered a job at the Jenkins Company.
Tell us a little about how that came about.
Well, that was toward the end of 1980, and I took the job at the Jenkins Company, worked there for 6 years, learned a lot, had a lot of fun. Jenkins was a great mentor, a real raconteur, a good guy to work for me, for literature, because he kind of stayed out of he kind of turned over the literature department to me and let me run it my way. He didn't run interference. He didn't come back and try to recatalog my books and tell me how to run that part of the business. As long as I was running it and making a whole lot of money for him, he was happy to let me just handle it my way. I'm not sure other people that worked for him would feel the same way, because he felt more expertise in the areas of Western Americana and Texana and other branches of the
but
operations.
Literature, you were left alone.
He kind of left me alone, so I found him easier to work for, I think, than some other employees did. Learned a lot from him. I would count John Jenkins among my mentors, and I know that a lot of people have a low opinion of John Jenkins because of his involvement in forgeries and thefts and other activities, and that's all certainly well deserved, but he was a compulsive gambler, and that's what led him into that direction. But working for him, just speaking to that part of him, I thought he was a pretty good boss, and I learned a lot from him. He was very good at generating excitement and generating buzz. He was not very good at holding on to his money. And so I learned both positive and negative lessons working there.
He was one in a line, I guess you could say. There haven't been too many of the real kind of celebrity bookseller.
He was. He was very good at
Dr.
generating.
Rosenbach, maybe, and a
he
few
was.
others.
He was very good at generating excitement, generating buzz. I think the only time that he misstepped that was memorable was when he got interviewed by Time magazine. I think it was Time. It may have been Newsweek, but one of the news magazines called him up out of the blue as a rare book expert, and they asked him what kind of books had appreciated and valued the most in recent years. Now, this is a guy that held sway in Texana and Americana and Civil War and travel and exploration and high spot literature and all these areas. And you would think that, being John Jenkins, he would have had a self-serving answer that would fit into one of those niches. And he told them Charlie Brown books. We don't know where that came from. I don't know why he said that, but for the next 6 months, all we could do was answer the phone and take calls from people wanting to know what their Charlie Brown books were worth. And we ribbed John a lot for that.
I would imagine
why that popped into his head, what led him in that direction, I don't know. When we read the interview and they said Charlie Brown books, we were all just appalled. Well, nothing against Charlie Brown, Charles Schultz, or any of that, or Lucy, or any of the rest of Linus, the rest of them. Nice kids, but
John Jenkins could be impulsive, and that clearly was a case of that.
Yeah. But that first year working for Jenkins cemented my career in the rare book business. I learned then and there that was where I was going to be. Wild horses could not drag me back into library work, because I could pursue research and library type work on my own, and I could have the travel and the fun and deal with different books and different personalities and do all the things that I'd been watching other booksellers do from my vantage point as a librarian just a few years before.
So when you went to work for Jenkins, you really hit the ground running, and you pretty much immediately took over the literature department?
I did. Terry Halliday had been his my immediate predecessor, but there was a time lag between the time that Terry left and the time I got there, and during that time the literature department at Jenkins got ripped to pieces and was in disarray. And by the time I got there, it was a mess. And he had acquired a lot of new books and new collections. All the work that Terry had done had basically been undone. And my job was to come in there and clean it up and get it up and running again and get it organized. And I did that in about 30 days, had a catalog out at the end of 30 days, and had a positive cash flow at that point once that catalog was out. And from then on in, he decided he would just let me kind of run that into the business almost independently from the rest of the operation, and that worked well for both of us.
That was around 1981, was it?
About 1980, toward the end of 1980, and I worked there until about the end of 86. I gave notice after his first book fire during my time there. He had had 3 previous fires to that. A rent house, an art gallery, and a book storage warehouse or a book store. And he had a fire, I believe, in October of 85. No, Christmas of 85. And so I stuck with him for about another year to help kind of get things put back together. During that time, noticed a lot of things that made me have second thoughts about how he was running his business and the origins of the fire and all the rest of it, and left the company at the end of that year. And he was very gracious, and when I left, he let me have the Jenkins Deadbeat list, which was a list of all the ne'er-do-wells, non-payers, crackpots, all that kind of stuff we always have to put up with as
sort of
sellers.
A negative mailing list?
Yeah, and he put a notice in the next catalog announcing that I was leaving, and that people, and so a lot of customers there followed me. I don't know if John intended to continue the literature end of his operations. As it turned out, he didn't, but I don't know what his intent was at the time. But he was very generous when I left, allowing me to run a notice in the catalog announcing that I was leaving, and sharing the deadbeat list with me, which he wasn't going to share the mailing list with me, of course, but the deadbeat list he certainly did, because that would help me avoid the pitfalls and losses. And so I have nothing to say against him as far as being an employer, as far as that relationship.
And a mentor.
And a mentor, yeah. I learned a lot from him. And he was a smart man and knew a lot about books and people. Just the psychology of bookselling. I can share with you one thing that he taught all of us there was that if you're going to offer somebody a good book, don't offer them 2 good books at the same time. The reason being that if those books are roughly equivalent and you give them a choice, you're presenting them with a choice, they're going to decline one and maybe take the other. Problem is, you can't take the book they declined and offer it to them later, because psychologically they've already declined it and they're less likely to buy that second copy later. So it's better if you've got 2 good books for one customer, quote them one. Once you've got their commitment on that one, depending on how well you know the customer and their budget, wait a week, a month, whatever, and then offer them the next book, because then it's fresh to them and they haven't previously declined it. So just as a matter of customer psychology, and that doesn't apply to all customers in all situations, but I see booksellers make that mistake. And that was a little trick that John taught all of us, browbeat us, to a rule to follow. And a lot of others similar to that about how to handle sales. He had a very good sense of how, like I said, how to create buzz, how to generate sales, how to create excitement, how to deal with customers.
Who were some of the other future booksellers who were working at Jenkins when you were there?
Mike Parrish was there. Mike Heaston was there. Mike Parrish entered the book business briefly, but now works at a university. Right. Dorothy Sloan was there and later became an auctioneer. Before me, Richard Morrison had been there. Richard's passed away since, but Richard became a bookseller on his own. Ben Pingenot, who had been a bookseller prior to working there, and a very dear friend of mine, he worked there later, and he passed away, 10 years ago now. But he returned to bookselling on his own after he left Jenkins. A number of others, and if I've left anyone out, I'm apologizing, but just off the top of my head, those are the people I worked with immediately that I remember.
We're unscripted here. So.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and prior to me being there too, Terry Halliday had worked there and later went to work at Reese.
Right.
And there were a lot of people. Ray Walton, as a bookseller, never worked for John Jenkins, but he got a lot of his inventory from John, either on consignment or in partnerships. Michael Ginsberg had a lot of material on consignment and partnerships with Jenkins. And so there were people closely allied with Jenkins,
right.
Who, even if they weren't employees, were closely associated with the firm.
Part of the family.
Yeah.
Well, when you left Jenkins, you immediately started your own business?
I did. I set up my business at the end of '86. And got it up and running, and I kind of followed the Jenkins model. I went out and bought every mailing list I could get my hands on from every magazine, bookseller, journal, collecting organization that I could find, and built up a fairly massive mailing list very quickly that way, recognizing a lot of the names from my days at Jenkins. Almost reconstructed the literature portion of the Jenkins list just by doing that, by buying all these mailing lists. Set it up. I got computerized very quickly because Jenkins was computerized. He had been computerized back in the 70s at the same time that I was doing computerized OCLC cataloging at University of Houston. So computers and books were nothing new to me. In fact, in my days at the University of Houston, I had sold a Flannery O'Connor first edition via email to another librarian back in about 1973 or 74, and that may count as the first internet book sale ever.
Kevin, that is impressive. If anyone has any evidence of an earlier internet sale, I'd like to hear about.
A good man is hard to find. Fine in a dust jacket with just a hint of spine fading, much less than what you usually see, $65. I remember the book.
Those were the days.
I remember the customer. Son of a gun, he probably still has that book. It's worth
Probably
a little
does.
more now.
Just a bit.
But I sold it to him via it was the email system within OCLC where you could communicate with other librarians if you were a full OCLC catalog.
So now you were, of course, a by appointment seller, working out of an office, your home?
Worked out of a home. I printed catalogs, which I generated camera-ready copy out of my computer to produce, and operated out of my home. I had built a home with a third floor, carpeted and trimmed out, everything, but unheated, uncooled, and used that as the area for the book inventory.
So I imagine it would be a safe assumption to say that you were never intimidated or afraid of the internet and the computer and the potential that it would bring to the book trade.
Well, I could foresee some of the downside and some of the upside, but as far as the technical end of it, just getting books uploaded to the internet and exploiting it, I was already computerized, ready to go, so it was just a matter of taking my existing stock and creating a little FTP upload file and load it up to, what was it then? They've all interlock and then pre-interlock, and I can't remember what they all were.
All the matching sites.
I just remember how slow my dial-up connection was. If I was out on the road and I needed to go look up something in interlock, and I remember in hotels that I would actually, you have to remember this is many years ago, I would pull the phone out and pull the wires out and splice. There was no such thing as a modem connection in a phone, so I would pull the wires out of a phone and splice it together. I carried my own connectors, and I would put my connector, and I also do a line test because they had a lot of reverse polarity, and you could blow your computer to bits. So I would test everything, splice it. I had a double female plug, and I'd plug things into it, and then I'd dial in remote. And of course, it was terribly slow. And they had an email system there. And of course, if someone sent you a long email or an email with any kind of a scan or attachment, there was 30 minutes waiting for that to download.
30 expensive minutes.
Expensive minutes, yeah. It was like 50 cents a minute or 25 cents a minute. It was terrible. Expensive. Oh, yeah. And so it was always risky to do that. But, and I also had a laptop computer. It must have weighed 15 pounds, half the size of a modern laptop, about 4 or 5 inches thick. Klutzy thing. K-Pro something, and it was the first, I had a laptop previously to that, but this one had the CD driver. It was one of the first 2 laptops to have a CD driver, and you could lift the keyboard up and load a CD in. And I had bought the American Book Prices Current CD. So I had auction records with me on CD everywhere I went to.
You must have been one of the first to...
Among the very first. Had a Mariab Fair up in Boston. I remember another bookseller, who was the bookseller, he also had a K-Pro with the CD driver, and there were hardly any of the booksellers at that time with laptops, period, and very few computerized even. And so but I had this thing, and I had a security chain on it, and had it wrapped around my table and hidden away, and thought my computer was safe and secure there. And I was out just scouting the fair and walked up to his table, and there's my computer sitting there. And of course, the first thought in my mind is, son of a gun, he stole my, son of a bitch actually, but we'll say son of a gun. And he stole my computer, you know, I mean, who else had one of those? And I was sitting there, and the gall to leave it out on the table, you know.
For the whole world to see.
Oh yeah, not even ashamed, you know. I thought, my gosh, and then he walked up, and we had a conversation. I laughed, I told him what I thought, and he didn't even know I had one. He couldn't believe it. He came back, looked at my table. We just thought we were the two smartest guys on the planet, that we had, you know, the auction records on CD and loaded into a laptop, and
you may not have been
all
the
these
smartest,
Luddites that were around us had no idea.
You were way ahead.
Yeah.
Well, I certainly don't need to ask you what it was like to move your business into the world of the internet, because you were ready for it from the word go.
Quick and easy.
But what, besides the internet, the impact of the internet, what are some of the other things that have really changed in the book trade since you started out?
There's still the camaraderie and the sociability, the collegial atmosphere, and certainly the ABA has promoted that, and being a member of the ABA has preserved that part of it. I think the internet has been isolating for a lot of booksellers because it allows them to work out of their home, it allows them not to have a shop, it allows them not to interact personally face-to-face with other booksellers, it allows them to avoid other venues like book fairs and whatever. So I think it has an isolating factor. I also think the internet has reduced the amount of scholarship and learning in the book trade. It's made a lot of information available, but information isn't knowledge, and knowledge isn't information, and they're mistaken oftentimes to be the same thing.
Information isn't necessarily correct.
No, you can get information on the internet. You can copy someone else's description without knowing what the bibliographical references or what the words mean. And I think a lot of people use it as a substitute instead of a reference library. And you hear this all the time, and I think the dumb-down effect from that is that people avoid getting a reference library and avoid learning these things themselves. They couldn't collate a book to save their life. They own very few reference books. They use the internet as their price guide and their bibliographies, and it's just not a substitute for that. And price-wise, I think what I call the lemming factor, that if somebody lists a book on the internet and someone else goes there and finds that book, they assume that's the right price. And if the first person, and then everyone follows right off the cliff, because if that first person priced a $100 book $10, everyone else is going to price it $10, $12, $8, $9, $15, depending on whether it's inscribed or a jacket or condition or whatever, but it's a $100 book. Well, I'm happy to take advantage of those situations when I stumble across them, but on the other hand, it's kind of sad that it works that way. I think part of the fun of bookselling is the research, and the internet. I'm not sure that, you know, trolling around for information on the internet can be called research. No. Especially if you just accept whatever you find at face value.
Nor is it a substitute for handling books.
No, there's no substitute for that, and that's why I say it's isolating. I think a lot of people don't get out there and freeze their butts off in a book barn and look for books and go to the book sales and that kind of thing. I think a lot of people just try to do it all by computer now. And
Kevin, what would you tell someone today, some younger person or someone with some ambition who wanted to enter the book trade?
I'd probably tell them the same thing that George Goodspeed told me when I told him that I was thinking about entering the book trade. And this was about 1971 or 72, and he just shook his head no. He says, "Oh, bad idea. It's hard to get into. It's hard to make a living. I had an existing business. My father was in the trade, but if you were starting from scratch, if you were trying to start the business and get started in the business, it would just be impossible." He was very discouraging. And but he was telling me all of the pitfalls and the reasons, the things that would be hard. None of that discouraged me, but it did prepare me to deal with those things. It didn't prepare me as well as my own first-hand knowledge, but I would be discouraging. I'd be cautioning people, because being a bookseller requires two things. It requires being a good bookman, and it requires being a good businessman. And I know a lot of dear friends in the book trade who are great bookmen and lousy businessmen. I know other ones who are extremely good businessmen and ho-hum bookmen. You can get by if you're mediocre in both, but you can't do well if you're just lacking in one or the other. And the thing that I have a hard time dealing with when I give advice to somebody that wants to go into the business is, well, how good a bookman are you and how good a businessman are you? And I have no way of assessing that when someone asks me that kind of a question. And I think a lot of the predictability of their success is going to be dependent on that, whether they're a good bookman, whether they have a good sense of the books, and whether they're a good businessman.
You've been married for many years. Has your wife, Donna, ever been involved in the business, or she had her own business?
Not until she semi-retired a few years ago. She was a school administrator for 25 years in one district, a teacher and school administrator for about 30 years. So she's a very independent, authoritative woman, used to big budgets and dealing with people and ordering people around and managing people and parents and kids and teachers and everything. And in my life outside the book business, I'm a fire commissioner. I sat on utility boards, so I have a broader experience than just the book trade. So she retired, semi-retired a few years ago, and then took full retirement just this past year. And that's allowed her to travel with me now. And she's actively participating in the book business now, at least when I go to book fairs when I travel. She knows nothing about rare books, doesn't know anything about the book trade. Here at this Seattle Book Fair, all of the books that we have sold have been books that she chose to bring to the book fair, not me.
That's a telling statement, Kevin.
What do I know?
Not about you, but about the book trade in general and about book fairs.
It's hard to predict.
You don't know at
Hard
any
to
given
predict.
time.
Yeah.
We've talked about John Jenkins and some of the other people that work there. Who were some of the other, George Goodspeed you mentioned, who were some of the other booksellers that you consider influential?
The people I interacted with the most, there was Colleen Urbanek, who opened up a bookstore, Colleen's Books and Things, on Telephone Road in Houston, a short, about a 10-minute bicycle ride from my house.
The roller skating turtle?
The roller skating turtle,
That was her
rubber
little
stamp
logo.
that she put on everything. Colleen had been a school teacher. She was quite a lady. I could tell you a lot of stories. But she was set up while I was in high school. I think she set up her business about 1969 or 70. And it was right there by my neighborhood. And I'd go down there all the time and visit with her. She was a dear, dear lady. She died in her 80s about 3 or 4 years ago. And Howard Mott, Michael Pampantonio, John Cohn, George Goodspeed, Harold Burstein, Jake Zeitlin. Didn't interact with Warren Howell. He did not have time for the little people like me. Jake Zeitlin was always very gracious. Those are people I dealt with early on that were prominent in the ABAA, I think all of them. And Colleen, of course, would have nothing to do with the ABAA.
No, I recall that.
She started out selling Harlequin romances, 2-for-1 swaps, and Chilton motor manuals, and but she was catering to her local market.
Lou
and
Weinstein,
very successfully doing it.
Lou Weinstein once told me we all sell used books.
We do.
Period.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Some are more fussy than others, and
That is correct. Here it is, 2008. Who do you see as the keepers of the flame, the young up-and-comers in our trade, the ones that maybe will still be around 50 years from now?
that's a tough question. I usually sit around with the old farts and bemoan the fact that we're all aging, that our customer base is aging, and that no one's coming up through the ranks. And so it's we have more fun sitting around engaging in this comforting gloom and doom kind of talk than talking about newcomers. I'd suppose it's mostly the modern literature dealers and some of the specialist dealers. I wouldn't be specific. I think some of the people are particularly well-wired and have learned to exploit the internet better than some of the older members of the trade like me.
I take it you're not one of the people who thinks that the book itself has no future, and if the book has a future, then the book trade has to have a future. Would that be fair to say?
I don't know if the book has a future or not. I think the Kindle or something like it may supplant the book for most reading material in the future. I really do see that happening, and I don't see that as an entirely bad thing. But I think book collecting will survive it because people will still want to collect books, even if They are a curiosity that was used back in the 20th, 19th, and 18th centuries and before. That sometime in the 21st century, say 50 years hence, when you and I are dust, that somebody will say, well, but we still collect books. They're kind of an interesting artifact. People today still collect clay tablets.
Yes, they do. I have some at home.
But none of us communicate with clay tablets that I'm aware of.
I tried. It doesn't work.
It doesn't work. It's very slow. You have to wait for the stuff to dry.
One more question, which I want to ask everybody, and I already know the answer in advance, I hope. Do you have any plans to retire from the book business?
No, you never retire from the book business. You just grow old, and your pages get brittle, and your spine gets chipped. You get a little foxed, all the old jokes, and you fade away, and that's it. What's the Ben Franklin epitaph? I think that'll fit most booksellers. You just stay at it. What else would you do?
I have no idea. I always say retire to what?
Well, I love my granddaughter, and I play and spend time with her, and I like gardening. I'm a trained concert pianist, so I play piano. There are other things I do, but as a career, as a means of a living, book selling, that's it. I don't know of anything else to do for a living. I have other things to do for fun, but not
I wish
for
we had a piano here. I'd get you to run through a few things.
Sure.
Kevin, thank you very much for joining us today.
Enjoyed it. It was fun.
Great, good.
Thank you, Taylor.